The rain on Vicara Prime was not water. Commandant Richal stood at the observation window of the 9th Ascendancy Training Annex, watching the downpour streak the armorplas in threads of pale amber. The precipitation was a suspension of mineral salts dissolved in an alkaline carrier, and it fell from the sky every 42 hours with the regularity of a military schedule. It etched shallow grooves into any surface left uncoated, including skin. The cadets assigned to outdoor drill modules were issued dermal sealant before every exposure session. A species with porous epidermis would blister within minutes. The human had been standing in the rain for an hour. Richal adjusted the magnification on the observation scope mounted into the window frame. The instrument was a relic from the annex's original construction, mechanical rather than digital, and he preferred it to the holographic feeds the younger instructors used. Through the scope, the human resolved into sharp focus against the gray drill yard below. She was small. All of them were small, these Terrans, but this one was notably so even by their compressed standards, a female, early 20s by their count, dark hair plastered flat against her skull. Standing at the parade rest position he had demonstrated to the intake cohort 6 hours ago. Her fatigues were soaked through, the mineral salts leaving faint white tide marks along the fabric where the rain pooled and evaporated against her body heat. She was the only cadet still standing. The rest of the intake, 41 cadets drawn from 11 species across the Ascendancy's membership tiers, had filed into the shelter barracks over the past 30 minutes. The drill instructions had been specific: maintain parade rest in the yard until the relief chime sounded. The chime had not sounded. The rain had started 20 minutes into the exercise. Richal had not called the cadets inside. He had not called the cadets anywhere. The test was whether they would hold position without being told to stop, or whether they would decide for themselves that the conditions had exceeded what was reasonable. Every cadet, except the human, had decided. Richal watched her through the scope. Her boots were regulation Ascendancy issue, 3 sizes too large, stuffed with packing material she had cut from her mattress cover that morning. He knew this because Instructor Davin had reported it with a note of professional irritation. The quartermaster's office had not stocked human-scaled equipment. The 9th Ascendancy had never enrolled a human before. The diplomatic provisioning request had arrived 4 days before the cadet herself, and the supply chain moved on cycles measured in standard weeks, not the frantic Terran unit they called days. Her name was Marin Salt. Her file listed her as the 3rd human to attend any military training institution within the Ascendancy's jurisdiction, and the 1st to attempt the 9th's command track program. Her admissions profile contained a single notable line under prior experience: 18 months, Terran Planetary Constabulary, Rural Division. Richal had looked up the Terran Constabulary. It was a law enforcement body, not a military one. The Rural Division operated in remote terrain with minimal support infrastructure, handling everything from wildlife management to emergency medical response to conflict mediation between isolated settlements. It was, by any military standard, not a qualification. The admissions board had waved her through on the Terran Inclusion Protocol, a diplomatic instrument that guaranteed a fixed number of training slots per cycle to humanity's provisional membership tier. The protocol had been negotiated by diplomats who had never visited a training annex. The slots were offered, humans filled them. Richal had been informed, not consulted. He adjusted the scope. Marin Salt had not moved. The rain was heavier now, the amber streaks thickening into sheets that hazed the far edge of the drill yard. Her hands were at her sides, fingers curled loosely, not clenched. Her shoulders were square. Her chin was level. The dermal sealant she had been issued was designed for caloric integument, a thick, viscous compound that sat on the surface of scaled skin and deflected the mineral salts. On human skin, porous and thin, it would have absorbed within the first 15 minutes, leaving her epidermis exposed. He could see the discoloration starting along her forearms. Faint pink, trending toward an angrier red where the rain collected in the creases of her rolled sleeves. It was not dangerous. Not yet. The mineral concentration in Vekaran rain was irritant grade, not caustic, but it was uncomfortable in a way that most species found persuasive. Rishal had been an instructor at the 9th Ascendancy for 23 standard years. He had trained 11 cohorts. He had watched cadets from every major species break against exercises less demanding than standing in the rain. He had watched Kalori warriors, armored from birth in subdermal plating that could deflect a blade, walk off the drill yard rather than endure a navigation exercise in darkness. He had watched Torvan cadets, whose forearmed physiology gave them a mechanical advantage in every physical task the Annex could devise, quit during the second phase of endurance conditioning, because the temperature dropped below their metabolic comfort threshold. He had watched his own kind, the Vashari, tall and angular, adapted for dry heat and long sight lines, struggle with the close quarters modules where the walls pressed in, and the ceiling dropped low enough to brush their crests. Every species had a point where the environment said stop, and the body agreed. He had not yet found the humans. The relief chimes sounded at the 68-minute mark. Rishal triggered it from his console, watching through the scope as the tone carried across the yard. Marin Salt remained at parade rest for 3 seconds after the chime, not because she hadn't heard it, he suspected, but because she was confirming it was real. Then she dropped her hands, rolled her shoulders once, and walked toward the shelter barracks at a pace that did not suggest urgency. She did not run, she did not hurry. She walked through the alkaline rain as if it were weather. Rishal made a note in her file. It was the first of many. The following morning, the intake cohort assembled in the primary instruction hall for the orientation brief. Rishal delivered it the same way he had delivered it for 23 years, standing on the raised platform at the front of the hall, hands clasped behind his back, voice modulated to carry to the rear tier without amplification. The Vashari vocal structure produced sound across a wide frequency band, and Rishal had spent years learning to use the lower registers that most species processed as authoritative. It was a craft, instruction, not merely the transfer of information, but the calibration of an environment in which failure was possible and survivable, and success was earned rather than issued. You have been selected for the command track of the 9th Ascendancy Training Annex, he told them. This track produces officers. Officers make decisions under conditions designed to break the decision-making apparatus. If you are here because you are talented, that talent will be tested until it bends. If you are here because you are strong, you will be placed in situations where strength is irrelevant. If you are here because your government negotiated a slot for you, your government cannot help you now. He let the silence sit. His eyes wide-set amber, with the horizontal pupils characteristic of Vashari step-adapted vision, moved across the rows. Kalori in their scaled bulk, taking up 2 seats each. Torvan with their forearms folded in various configurations of boredom and attention. 3 Celerin, small and quick-eyed, clustered together in the way their species defaulted to in unfamiliar environments. A pair of Neth, whose bioluminescent throat patches pulsed faintly in the hall's artificial light. And in the 4th row left side, Marin Salt. She sat in a seat designed for a Kalori, her feet not quite touching the floor, her back straight, her eyes on him, steady. Attentive, not performing attention, simply present in the way he had seen in perhaps 5 cadets across his entire career. He continued. The attrition rate for the command track is 61%. Of those who complete it, fewer than half are recommended for field command. The Annex does not accommodate species-specific limitations. The standard is the standard. Meet it or leave. He paused, and in the pause, he found himself looking at her again. Not because she was unusual in her smallness or her species, because she was the only cadet in the hall who appeared to have already heard this speech, processed it, and filed it under things that did not require a reaction. In his experience, that was either arrogance or something harder to name. After the briefing, Instructor Davin approached him in the corridor outside the hall. Davin was Kalori, compact by his species standards but still twice Rishal's mass, his scaled hide bearing the dark modeling of a Southern Hemisphere lineage. He had served as the Annex's physical conditioning lead for 9 years. "The human," Davin said. "Cadet Salt." She requested access to the physical conditioning hall during off hours, said she wanted to recalibrate the resistance equipment for her grip width. He paused. "The resistance equipment doesn't recalibrate below Celerin parameters. She's smaller than a Celerin." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the equipment specifications were fixed." She asked if she could bring hand tools from the maintenance bay and modify the grip attachments herself. "And?" I said no. She said thank you and left. 20 minutes later, I found her in the conditioning hall running the pull-up module with her hands wrapped in strips of cargo webbing she'd cut from a packing crate behind the supply dock. The webbing gave her enough friction to compensate for the oversized grip bars. She completed 14 repetitions. The minimum standard is 30. 14. She didn't stop because she couldn't continue. She stopped because the webbing tore. Davin's throat scales shifted a display his species used to convey professional concern. "Commandant. She is going to injure herself on equipment that was not designed for her physiology. Note it, do not intervene. If she fractures a wrist on a grip bar calibrated for a Torvin, then she will learn what her body can and cannot do. That is the purpose of the diagnostic week." Rishal met the Kalori's horizontal pupils. "Has she complained?" Davin was quiet for a moment. "No, she has not complained about anything since arrival. The thermal pad, the boots, the dermal sealant, the ration blocks, all of it calibrated for species 2 to 4 times her mass. She has not filed a single accommodation request." "That is data, log it." Davin inclined his head and left. Rishal stood in the corridor and considered the information. Every cadet he had ever trained who faced equipment mismatches had filed accommodation requests within the first 48 hours. It was expected. It was reasonable. The Annex had a process for it. Marin Salt had not used the process. She had cut strips from a packing crate and made the equipment fit. He did not know yet whether that was admirable or simply the behavior of a species that had never had the option of asking the environment to accommodate them. The first training week was diagnostic. Rishal designed it that way deliberately, a battery of assessments across physical conditioning, tactical reasoning, environmental adaptation, and command decision-making, calibrated to reveal not what cadets could do but where they would break. The breaking points were the data. Everything else was noise. The physical conditioning scores came first. Marin Salt ranked 39th out of 42. Her upper body strength was below the minimum threshold for 11 of the 17 standard exercises. Her sprint speed was unremarkable. Her reaction time was average. On the grip strength dynamometer, calibrated for Kalori and Torvin hands, her readings were so low the instrument flagged them as a sensor error. Rishal reviewed the scores that evening in his office, a spare room with a single window, a desk, and a shelf of physical books that his colleagues considered an affectation. He was not surprised by the humans' physical scores. He had read the species briefing. Humans were persistence predators from a world classified as a Category 4 deathworld, not the most hostile designation, but high enough to warrant special notation in the Ascendancy's Xenobiological Index. Their physical advantages were endurance, thermoregulation, and fine motor control. Their disadvantages were everything else. What interested him was the tactical reasoning module. The module presented cadets with a series of escalating command scenarios, holographic projections of battlefield situations, requiring real-time resource allocation, threat prioritization, and subordinate management. Most cadets performed as their species profile predicted. The Calori defaulted to direct confrontation, the Torvin to distributed force solutions, the Celerin to evasion and intelligence gathering. Species trained species. Biology shaped doctrine. Marin Solt's responses did not fit a profile. In the first scenario, a defensive position under assault by a numerically superior force, she had abandoned the position entirely, redeployed her simulated subordinates into a mobile screen, and collapsed the attacker's supply line with a flanking element so small the simulation's AI initially classified it as a rounding error. The attacker's advance stalled not because she fought them, but because they ran out of ammunition. In the second scenario, an evacuation under fire, she had prioritized casualties by survival probability, triaged the evacuation sequence to minimize total exposure time, and sacrificed one evacuation vehicle as a decoy. The decoy cost her 12 simulated personnel. The remaining 63 survived. No other cadet had scored above 51. In the third scenario, a negotiation with a hostile faction while a hidden threat maneuvered behind her, she had identified the hidden threat before the scenario revealed it. When asked how, her written response was 4 words. The room felt wrong. Rishal read that line 3 times. Then he pulled up his own cadet records from 23 years ago and found his own diagnostic response to an identical scenario variant. His answer had been 6 words. The spacing did not make sense. He closed the file and sat in the quiet of his office for a long time. The next morning, he arrived at the conditioning hall before dawn and found her already there. The cargo webbing strips had been replaced with new ones, cleaner cuts, more evenly wound. She was hanging from the pull-up bar with her eyes closed, her body still, her breathing controlled. She opened her eyes and dropped. "Commandant." "How many?" 17, 3 more than yesterday. "The minimum is 30. "I know, I'll be at 30 by end of week 2. It was not a boast. It was delivered in the same flat tone she used for everything, a statement of projected outcome based on rate of improvement. He had seen cadets with augmented neural processors make projections with less confidence. "Your tactical module results were notable," he said, and immediately regretted the word notable because it was the kind of carefully neutral language that instructors used when they had not yet decided what they were looking at. "I approach problems differently than your other cadets," she said. "That doesn't make the approach better, it makes it unmodeled." He looked at her sharply. "That word was in the simulation AI's classification report. You read it." "No, I guessed. The AI wouldn't have a category for solutions derived from a species it has no data on. It would flag the unknown, not evaluate it." She picked up the cargo webbing and began rewinding it around her hands. "On Earth, we have a saying. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Your simulation is a hammer built by species who think in straight lines. I don't think in straight lines. That doesn't make me better. It makes me a problem your tools aren't calibrated for." Rishal felt the recognition again, sharper this time. He left without saying anything else, because the words that wanted to form were not the words an instructor should say to a first-week cadet. The next 4 weeks were designed to sort the cohort. Rishal had refined the curriculum over 2 decades, and it was precise in its cruelty. Not cruel for the sake of it, cruel the way a surgeon's knife was cruel, cutting to the necessary depth and no further. The exercises escalated in complexity and duration. The environmental conditions shifted without warning. The sleep schedule was compressed to 5-hour rotations keyed to the Vashari circadian rhythm, which meant that every non-Vashari species was perpetually slightly sleep-deprived. It was deliberate. Officers operated in conditions that were never optimized for their biology. The Annex taught that lesson early. 14 cadets washed out in the first 2 weeks. 3 Calori, unable to function in the claustrophobic close-quarters navigation exercises. 4 Torvin, whose metabolic requirements made them vulnerable to the caloric deficit the Annex imposed during field phases. 2 Celerin, overwhelmed by the command decision modules that required committing subordinates to harm. 5 Cadets from 3 other species, broken by various combinations of physical and psychological load. Marin Sult did not wash out. She did not excel either in the way the frontrunners excelled. She was not the fastest, the strongest, the highest scoring. She was persistently, stubbornly adequate. In the physical modules, she finished near the bottom, but she finished. In the endurance conditioning, where the Annex pushed cadets through extended stress cycles designed to degrade performance, her scores declined less steeply than any other cadets. At hour 20 of a 30-hour navigation exercise in the Annex's wilderness terrain, when every other cadet's decision-making metrics had degraded by 40 to 60%, hers had degraded by 9. Rishal pulled the data 3 times, convinced the instruments were malfunctioning. They were not. The human's cognitive architecture did not deteriorate under sustained load the way other species did. It bent, it slowed, but it did not fragment. At hour 26, when 2 Calori cadets had to be pulled from the exercise after their spatial processing systems collapsed into recursive loops, Marin Sult was crouched at a stream crossing, building a water filter from gravel and a strip of her undershirt, humming something tuneless and quiet. He watched her through the monitoring feed and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not admiration that was too simple, recognition. The slow, professional acknowledgement that the instrument in front of him was reading correctly, and the reading was significant. By the end of week 2, Davin reported that Marin Sult had reached 31 pull-up repetitions. She had hit her projected target 1 day ahead of schedule. The cargo webbing had been replaced 3 times. On the 4th iteration, she had braided it into a double-layered grip wrap with a tensile strength Davin described as surprisingly competent for field-improvised equipment. "She's modifying the equipment without modifying the equipment," Davin said. His throat scales were arranged in the Calori display that Rishal had learned over 9 years to interpret as reluctant professional respect. She is adapting her interface with the equipment. There is a difference. It is a difference that produces the same result. No, one asks the world to change. The other changes itself to meet the world. The distinction matters. Davin considered this. "I have begun logging her pull-up count each morning. I do not know why." "Because you recognize progress," Rishal said, "and because you are an instructor and progress is the thing we are built to notice." The field exercise in week 3 was the first real test. Rishal designed it around a scenario the 9th had run for a decade, a simulated crisis requiring a cadet team to navigate hostile terrain, establish a defensive perimeter, manage limited resources, and execute a casualty evacuation under time pressure. The teams were assigned by Rishal personally. He placed Marin Sult in charge of a 6-cadet element that included 2 Calori, a Torvin, a Neth, and a Celerin. No other human, the smallest cadet commanding the largest. The exercise began at dawn. The terrain was the Annex's northern range, a broken landscape of volcanic rock, thermal vents, and sparse vegetation under a sky the color of bruised copper. Temperature varied from 4 degrees in the shadows to 38 at the vent fields. The opposition force was a Proctor team running a harassment pattern designed to impose constant low-level stress without triggering a decisive engagement. Rishal monitored from the Tactical Operations Center, a bunker cut into the ridge above the range. He had 6 screens showing feeds from the field, but he spent most of his time watching one. Marin Sult did not lead the way he had been trained to recognize leadership. She did not issue sharp commands. She did not stride ahead of her element. She moved among them, literally among them, walking in the center of the formation rather than at the point or the rear, talking to each cadet in turn, her voice low enough that the monitoring microphones barely caught it. He increased the gain on her channel and listened. "Keloth, your plates are locking on the left side. That's a heat stress response. Drink now, don't wait until you're thirsty. Your biology won't tell you in time." "Fennec, the Celerin corridor sweep you ran in the sim last week. Can you run it in broken terrain? I need eyes on the ravine before we cross. You're the fastest thing in this element, and the rocks won't bother you the way they bother the rest of us. Tormas, I need you to carry the casualty litter on your upper arms and keep your lower arms free for balance. You're the only one here who can do both at once. It's not a compliment, it's math." She deployed her element's species-specific advantages the way a machinist used specialized tools. Not generically. Precisely. She had studied her team's capabilities with a granularity that Richal recognized because it was the granularity he taught, and almost no cadet absorbed it in the first 3 weeks. When the opposition force hit them at the ravine crossing, she made a decision in 4 seconds that took Richal 3 minutes to fully appreciate. She had the Calori hold the crossing. Their armored bulk turned the narrow ravine into a wall nothing could push through. She sent the Celerin up the ravine's eastern face, where the small cadet's agility let her reach an observation point that the opposition had assumed was inaccessible. She had the Torvin provide suppressive fire from a position that used his four-armed reload speed to simulate a volume of fire the opposition interpreted as a full squad. And she moved through the ravine floor herself, alone below the sight lines, circling behind the opposition's left flank. The opposition proctor team lead, a veteran instructor named Cadet, was hit with a training marker on his dorsal plate from a position he had not scouted because no species in the ascendancy was small enough to fit through the gap in the rock formation she had used. He called halt, reviewed the engagement data, and filed a report that Richal read that evening. Cadet Salt exploited a terrain feature that was not included in the opposition's threat model because no species previously enrolled at this annex could have physically traversed it. Recommend updating the threat model. Recommend scrutiny of Cadet. Richal read the word scrutiny and crossed it out. He wrote observation. There was a difference. The field exercise report circulated among the proctors. Over the next 2 days, Richal received 3 separate communications about it. The first was from Cadet himself, who cornered him outside the refectory. She came through a gap in the rock that measured 40 centimeters at its widest point. 40 centimeters. I could not fit my arm through it. She is a small species. She is not just small. She is flexible, compressible, and apparently willing to crawl through spaces that would trigger confinement stress in every species in our psychological profile library. I checked. The Ascendancy's confinement stress threshold tables do not have a human entry. I will request one be added. The second communication was from the Annex's medical officer, a Neth named Suval, whose bioluminescent patches flickered through diagnostic sequences as she spoke. The human has visited the medical bay 11 times in 3 weeks, blistering from the dermal sealant mismatch, minor abrasions from equipment designed for larger hands, a strained shoulder from the pull-up module, bruised ribs from the sparring assessment where a calori connected with an elbow. Is she requesting medical withdrawal? No, she is requesting analgesic patches and returning to training. She has not missed a single scheduled module. I mention this because, in my medical opinion, the cumulative minor damage she is absorbing would have triggered a mandatory rest cycle for any other species by now. Her species appears to process pain as information rather than as a stop signal. The third communication was a formal note from the Annex's administrative office, forwarded without comment. The Terran Inclusion Protocols Oversight Committee had requested a progress update on Cadet Salt. Richal composed his response in 4 words. Cadet is on schedule. He did not elaborate because the truth was more complicated than a diplomatic oversight committee was equipped to process. The washout rate continued through weeks 4 and 5. 23 cadets remained of the original 42. Marin Salt was still among them, her physical scores still near the bottom, her tactical scores still near the top, and the gap between the two widening in a way that Richal's statistical models found increasingly difficult to reconcile. She adapted. That was the word he kept returning to. Not excelled, not overcame, not triumphed, adapted. When the Annex introduced gravitational variation modules, increasing the training hall's gravity to 1.4 standard, the Calori endured on raw mass, the Torvin distributed the load across 4 limbs, and the Celerin struggled and dropped out. Marin Salt's performance declined. Her stride shortened. Her reaction time slowed. But she adjusted her movement patterns within the first hour, lowering her center of gravity, shortening her steps, conserving energy in ways that suggested her body was running calculations her conscious mind did not need to supervise. When the Annex ran the thermal endurance module, a sealed chamber cycling between extremes, she managed the heat phases by sweating, a thermoregulatory mechanism so alien to the Vacherie that Richal had to look it up. Evaporative cooling. Her species expelled water through their skin and used the phase transition to shed heat. It was elegant in its simplicity and repulsive in its execution. 3 Calori cadets who witnessed it filed formal complaints. Richal denied them. When the Annex ran the low-visibility navigation module, a blacked-out course, requiring cadets to navigate by non-visual senses, she navigated by sound. Not echolocation, which several ascendancy species possessed, and which the module was designed to neutralize with acoustic countermeasures. She navigated by ambient sound, the hum of ventilation systems, the resonance of her own footsteps against different surface materials, the faint displacement of air around obstacles. Richal watched her move through the course on infrared monitoring and saw her pause at each junction, tilt her head fractionally, and proceed with a confidence that was not guesswork. She finished third, behind 2 cadets with species-native echolocation, ahead of everyone else. In the sparring modules, she lost every match, every single one. The Calori overpowered her, the Torvin outreached her. Even the Celerin, the closest to her in size, had a reaction speed advantage rooted in a nervous system that processed motor commands faster than the human peripheral system could manage. But Richal noticed something in the sparring data that the automated scoring missed. She lost every match, but the duration of her matches was increasing. In week 2, her average bout lasted 41 seconds. By week 4, it was 2 minutes and 18 seconds. She was not getting stronger. She was not getting faster. She was learning her opponents, their timing, their tells, the species-specific patterns that governed how each one opened, escalated, and committed. In a sparring bout against the Calori cadet Keloth, she lasted 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Keloth outweighed her by 120 kilograms. In the final 30 seconds, she landed a strike open palm, precisely targeted at the gap between Keloth's dorsal plates where the nerve cluster was most exposed. It was not a powerful strike. It was a knowledgeable one. Keloth's left arm went numb for 6 seconds. The match ended with Keloth pinning her, but in the post-match review, Keloth sought Richal out. "She knew where my plates were thinnest," Keloth said. "She has been watching me spar for 4 weeks. She mapped my armor gaps." "That troubles you." "It does not trouble me. It concerns me that no other cadet has ever studied my biology closely enough to exploit it. She is not fighting me as a fighter. She is fighting me as a student. Every bout is a lesson she is collecting." Richal logged the observation and added it to a file that was growing thicker by the day. Richal began staying late in his office. He told himself it was the curriculum review cycle. It was partly true, but the files he reviewed most often were hers, and the data he studied most closely was the pattern he could feel forming but could not yet name. In week 5, the Annex ran the command stress assessment. It was Richal's own design, the exercise he considered his contribution to the 9th's pedagogy. 20 cadets were divided into 4 elements. Each element was given a mission, a resource constraint, and a moral complication. The missions were straightforward. The resource constraints made them difficult. The moral complications made them impossible. Element 3, commanded by Marin Salt, was tasked with securing a simulated settlement while protecting a civilian population. The resource constraint was ammunition enough for a short engagement, not enough for a sustained one. The moral complication was that the simulated opposition force had embedded itself among the civilian population, using them as cover. Most cadets faced with this scenario defaulted to one of two responses: aggressive clearance, accepting civilian casualties as collateral, or passive defense, holding position and hoping the opposition made a mistake. Both responses earned passing marks. Neither earned distinction. Marin Salt did neither. She divided her element into two groups. The first group established a visible defensive perimeter around the settlement, obvious, loud, deliberately drawing the opposition's attention. The second group, led by her, entered the settlement on foot, unarmed, and began evacuating the civilian population. Rishal watched from the Tactical Operations Center as she walked into a simulated conflict zone without a weapon. She moved through the settlement speaking directly to the simulated civilians, holographic constructs with basic behavioral programming, guiding them toward the evacuation corridor her first group had secured. The opposition force, confronted with an unarmed cadet moving among their cover population, faced a targeting dilemma the scenario's designers had not anticipated. Engaging her would reveal their positions and eliminate their cover simultaneously. She evacuated 31 of 35 simulated civilians in 14 minutes. Then she armed herself with a weapon taken from a simulated casualty, re-entered the settlement, and cleared the remaining opposition positions in 6 minutes. The scenario's scoring algorithm could not process the result. It had been designed to evaluate cadets on a spectrum between aggression and caution. Marin Salt had operated on a spectrum it did not have a variable for. Rishal sat in the operations center after the other proctors had left. He replayed the exercise 3 times. On the third viewing, he paused the playback at the moment she had walked into the settlement without a weapon. Her face on the feed was calm, not steeled for impact calm, not performing courage calm. Calm in the way a person was calm when they had already run the calculation and accepted the terms. He recognized it because he had seen it once before, 23 years ago, in a mirror, on the day he had walked into his first real engagement as a young officer, and understood that the training had been preparing him for this exact species of quiet. The conversation happened in week 6, after the night navigation exercise. Rishal was walking the perimeter of the annex grounds, a habit, the kind of late evening circuit that let him process the day's data away from screens and files. The grounds were quiet. Vikara Prime's twin moons hung in the western sky, their light filtered through the mineral haze that the evening winds lifted from the alkaline flats beyond the annex walls. The air smelled like chalk and ozone. He found her at the eastern overlook, sitting on the low retaining wall with her legs dangling over the edge, looking out at the flats. The alkaline desert stretched to the horizon, white and featureless under the moonlight. She was wearing her fatigues and a thermal layer she had jury-rigged from a supply crate's insulation lining. It was not standard issue. It was functional. "Cadet," he said. She turned, "Commandant. You should be in barracks." I couldn't sleep." He should have sent her back. Instead, he walked to the wall and stood beside her, looking out at the same view. The alkaline flats were beautiful in a way that the annex's architects had never intended anyone to notice. The moon's light turned the mineral surface into a sheet of dull silver, and the wind drew patterns across it that shifted and dissolved like thought. "Your scores in the command stress assessment were unprecedented," he said. It was not how he had planned to open the conversation. He had not planned the conversation. "The scenario had a gap," she said. "The opposition's advantage was their cover. Remove the cover, Evacuate the civilians and the advantage collapses. The scoring system didn't account for that approach because it was designed around engagement, not disengagement. You walked in unarmed. They couldn't shoot me without exposing their positions. The civilians were their shield. I made myself part of that shield. That analysis assumes the opposition would behave rationally. It assumes they'd behave like soldiers. Soldiers protect their advantages. Their advantage was concealment. Firing at an unarmed target in the middle of their cover population destroys concealment. They held fire because holding fire was tactically correct, not because they were moral. Rishal studied her profile against the alkaline flatlight. Her features were small by Vacherie standards. Everything about humans was small by Vacherie standards, but there was a structural economy to her face that he found increasingly difficult to dismiss. No excess, every line functional. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Learn what?" "The gap analysis, the willingness to enter a threat environment unarmed on the basis of a tactical calculation. That is not in any curriculum I have ever seen." She was quiet for a moment. "I was a constable, rural division, 2 years in the Terran outback. We covered territories larger than this annex's entire training range. 1 constable, 1 vehicle, and whatever you could carry. The settlements were isolated. When something went wrong, a predator incursion, a structural failure, a dispute that had turned violent, you couldn't wait for backup. You walked in with what you had, and what you usually had was yourself. And if what you had was not enough, then you made it enough. You read the situation. You figured out what the situation needed and what you could provide. Sometimes what it needed was force. Sometimes what it needed was someone to stand in the middle and be the thing nobody was willing to shoot. That is an extraordinary amount of trust in the rationality of the threat. It's not trust, it's calculation. You assess the threat's incentive structure. If shooting you costs them more than not shooting you, they don't shoot. It's not about being brave. It's about understanding that the other side is doing math too. Rishal felt the recognition again, the slow, deep register vibration of encountering a mind that operated on frequencies he understood because they were his own, despite the vast biological gulf between them. He had spent 23 years teaching cadets to think this way. He had never met one who arrived already thinking it. "Your physical scores are a liability," he said, because honesty was the only currency worth spending in this moment. "You are the weakest cadet in the cohort by every standard physical metric. In a real engagement, your body will fail before your mind does." "I know. You know, and you are still here." "My body is a tool. It has limitations. I work within them." On Earth, we had a word for animals that survived not because they were the biggest or the fastest, but because they were the most willing to keep going after everything else had stopped. Persistence. It's not a physical trait. It's a decision architecture. My body will fail. My decision-making won't. He looked at her. In the flat moonlight, her skin was pale and faintly pink where the mineral rain had left its marks. The discoloration would fade. The marks were temporary. The thing underneath them was not. "You stood in the rain," he said. The drill order was to hold parade rest until the relief chime. Every other cadet left. The relief chime hadn't sounded. The order was the order. The rain was just weather. Rishal turned back to the alkaline flats. The wind had shifted, drawing new patterns across the mineral surface. He stood there for a long time, feeling the night air against his crest, processing data that no file or feed or scoring algorithm could have given him. "Report to barracks, Cadet Salt." "Yes, Commandant." She slid off the wall and walked toward the barracks wing. He watched her go, small against the annex architecture, dwarfed by doorframes built for species a meter taller, walking with the unhurried gait of someone who had been walking through environments not built for her since the day she arrived, and had never once adjusted her pace to acknowledge it. In week 6, 2 days after the overlooked conversation, Rishal received a request from the Annex's Curriculum Review Committee. They wanted to discuss the human cadet's tactical reasoning scores. Specifically, they wanted to know whether the scoring methodology was sound, or whether the unmodeled solutions she produced were inflating her results through a gap in the assessment framework. Rishal attended the meeting. 4 senior proctors sat around a table in the committee room, their species a cross-section of the Ascendancy's military establishment. Cadet was there, his training marker incident still fresh. So was Davin, who had brought Marin Salt's physical conditioning data on a tablet he kept turning over in his scaled hands as if the numbers were a puzzle he could not stop rearranging. "The concern," said the committee chair, a Torvin logistics specialist named Jaren, "is that her tactical solutions are not accessible within our current framework. If the scoring system cannot evaluate what she does, we cannot certify her performance." Rishal considered his words before speaking. "The scoring system evaluates outcomes. Her outcomes are consistently superior. The fact that her methodology is unmodeled does not invalidate the results." "It raises questions about reproducibility," Jaren said. "Reproducibility is a concern for doctrine. It is not a concern for officer assessment. We are not evaluating whether other species can do what she does. We are evaluating whether what she does works. And if it works because the system is not designed to counter it. That is an artifact, not a skill." Rishal looked at the Torvin for a long time. Every species that has ever entered this annex has exploited the gaps between what the system expects and what they actually do. The Kalori exploit the system's assumption that armored species are slow to reposition. The Vashari exploit the system's assumption that tall species sacrifice agility for reach. Your own species exploits the system's assumption that 4-armed logistics is equivalent to 2-armed logistics at twice the speed, when in fact it is qualitatively different. He paused. The human exploits the system's assumption that all tactical reasoning follows ascendancy doctrine. That is not an artifact. That is the system encountering a variable it has not previously measured. The committee voted to continue scoring her under the existing framework. Rishal noted that the vote was not unanimous and filed that observation alongside the others. In weeks 7 and 8, the Annex entered the final phase. Integrated command exercises, full cohort scenarios requiring coordination between elements, sustained operations over multi-day cycles, and the capstone exercise that determined final rankings and command recommendations. Rishal watched her integrate. It was the thing he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. The individual assessments had shown him what she could do alone. The element exercises had shown him how she used a small team. The integrated phase showed him something else. How a species that was physically the weakest individual in the room could become the structural center of a formation without anyone noticing the shift. She did not take over. She consulted. She asked questions that reframed problems. In planning sessions, she would sit quietly while the Kalori element commanders debated force disposition, and the Torvin logistics officers calculated supply chains, and then she would say something that was not a command but landed with the weight of one. What if the supply chain doesn't hold? What if they've already moved by the time we arrive? What does the terrain look like from their perspective? Questions that no one else was asking because the curriculum trained cadets to solve the problem as presented, not to question the problem's assumptions. Rishal had spent 23 years trying to teach that skill. He had never seen a cadet deploy it instinctively. The other cadets began deferring to her. Not formally, the Annex's command structure was rigid and rank-based, and she held no rank advantage. Informally, they asked her opinion. They adjusted their plans after she spoke. A Kalori element commander named Vorin, who outweighed her by 140 kilograms, and whose species had never in recorded history deferred to a smaller organism, began routing his tactical plans through her before submitting them to the proctors. Rishal watched this happen the way a cartographer watches a river change course, with the understanding that the underlying geology had made it inevitable, and the awareness that the map would need to be redrawn. He saw it most clearly in the logistics planning session on the second day of the integrated phase. The 23 remaining cadets were seated around the tactical projection table in the operations briefing room, a circular chamber designed so that every seat had an equal view of the holographic display in the center. The mission was a multi-element deployment across 3 terrain sectors, each with different environmental challenges and opposition profiles. Standard doctrine called for assigning elements based on combat capability, the strongest to the hardest sector, the weakest to the easiest. Marin Salt was not in command. The command rotation had placed a Kalori named Vorin at the top of the chain. But Vorin, who had commanded Kalori border units before entering the annex, turned to her before announcing his deployment order. "Salt, your assessment." She looked at the projection for 11 seconds. Rishal timed it. "Sector 2 is the hardest fight," she said, "but the hardest fight isn't always the one that costs you the most. Sector 3 has the environmental complication. The thermal gradient will degrade Kalori plate integrity within 4 hours, and Torvin metabolic efficiency within 6. If we assign our strongest combat element to Sector 2 and our strongest endurance element to Sector 3, we win both sectors but lose the ability to reinforce between them, because the endurance element will be too depleted to redeploy." She paused. The room was quiet. "Assign a mixed element to Sector 3 Kalori for the first 3 hours of heavy work, then rotate them out to Sector 2 as reinforcement and bring in the Torvin for the sustained operations phase. The rotation costs us 40 minutes of transit, but it means both elements operate within their optimal biological window instead of degrading past it, and put a Celerin scout team in the gap between sectors to cover the rotation." Vorin looked at her for a long time. Then he issued her deployment plan as his own order. Nobody in the room pointed out that it hadn't been his idea. Nobody needed to. Rishal, watching from the observation gallery above the briefing room, made a note. The plan was not remarkable for its tactical insight, which was considerable. It was remarkable because it required understanding the biological performance curves of 4 different species well enough to optimize their deployment windows against terrain-specific degradation rates. That was not a skill the Annex taught in the first 8 weeks. That was a skill that required studying your fellow cadets the way a naturalist studied an ecosystem, not as competitors, but as components of a system whose output depended on each part operating where it functioned best. He had been teaching that philosophy for 23 years. He had never seen a cadet embody it before she had been taught it. After the session, Davin found him in the corridor. "She's not leading them," Davin said. "She's optimizing them. There is a word in the Kalori military lexicon for this. We call it Rishkal, the one who arranges the pieces. It is not a command rank. It is something older, something we do not award because it cannot be appointed. It is recognized." Rishal looked at the Kalori instructor. In 9 years of working together, Davin had never used a word from his species' military tradition in a professional context. The fact that he reached for it now was itself data. "She pulled 34 repetitions this morning," Davin added, as if it were related. Perhaps it was. The capstone exercise ran for 72 hours. It was the Annex's most demanding assessment. A full cohort operation requiring the remaining 23 cadets to plan, execute, and adapt a complex mission across the Annex's entire training range. Multiple objectives, shifting conditions, live opposition, resource constraints, and a command rotation that forced every senior cadet to lead and every junior cadet to follow, and then lead and then follow again. Rishal did not intervene. The capstone was the cadets' exercise. The proctors observed, scored, and extracted cadets who were injured or incapacitated. Everything else was theirs. For the first 20 hours, the exercise proceeded within expected parameters. The cadets rotated command effectively, executed their assigned objectives with reasonable efficiency, and managed the opposition force's harassment tactics without significant losses. Rishal scored them in real time from the operations center, his notes precise, his assessments calibrated against 23 years of capstone data. At hour 22, the first environmental shift hit a simulated atmospheric contamination in Sector 1 that forced Element Alpha to abandon their forward position and fall back to the secondary perimeter. The command rotation placed a Torvin named Mosk in charge during the transition. He managed it competently. Orderly withdrawal, no casualties, effective perimeter reestablishment. At hour 25, the second shift, opposition force reinforcements entered Sector 3, escalating the threat level beyond what the cadets' defensive posture could sustain. A Kalori element commander made the call to consolidate, pulling two elements together and abandoning the tertiary objective. It was the correct decision, tactically sound, well executed. At hour 28, fatigue began to degrade the cohort's decision-making. Rishal watched the metrics on his screens. Reaction times lengthened. Command decisions took longer to formulate and execute. The precision that had characterized the first day gave way to the blurred, approximated thinking that sleep deprivation imposed on every biological system the Ascendancy had ever studied. Every biological system except one. Marin Salt was not in command at hour 28. She was serving as a subordinate element in Sector 2, running a supply line security detail that was nominally routine. But Rishal noticed, because by now he was always noticing that she had positioned herself at the junction point between Sectors 2 and 3, the exact location where she could observe both sectors' command channels simultaneously. She was not monitoring the channels through any official capacity. She was listening. The way she listened to everything, not for specific signals, but for patterns, for the sound of a formation beginning to fray. At hour 30, she requested permission from her element commander to relay a supply route observation to the Sector 3 command. Permission was granted. The observation was minor, a note about terrain drainage patterns that would affect vehicle movement after the simulated rainstorm. The environmental AI had scheduled for hour 32. It was also, Rishal realized later, a test. She was testing whether the command structure would allow cross-sector communication from a junior element. It did. She filed that information. At hour 31, the exercise pivoted. A simulated environmental crisis, a chemical breach in the Annex's water reclamation system, forced the cadets to abandon their primary objective and manage an evacuation of simulated personnel from the Annex's lower levels. It was not part of the original mission. It was a test of adaptability, the ability to discard the plan and respond to the situation as it existed, not as it was supposed to exist. The command rotation placed Marin Salt in overall command at hour 33. Rishal watched from the operations center as she took the briefing from the outgoing commander, a Torvin named Jarek who had performed steadily throughout the exercise. She listened. She asked 3 questions. She issued her first orders within 90 seconds. The orders were not what anyone expected. She split the cohort into 3 functional groups based on species capability, not rank. Kalori to structural reinforcement. Their mass and durability made them the only cadets who could safely work in the contaminated lower levels without protective equipment the Annex did not have. Torvin to logistics and transport. Their four-armed efficiency made them the fastest at moving supplies and equipment through narrow corridors. Everyone else to the evacuation itself, organized not by military protocol, but by a triage framework she described in 30 seconds that prioritized mobility-impaired simulated personnel first, then dependents, then ambulatory civilians. "This isn't a military operation anymore," she told them. "It's a rescue. Military doctrine will get people organized. It won't get them out alive. We need to think like first responders, not soldiers. That means the mission is the people, not the objective." Rishal listened to her voice on the command channel. It was steady, unhurried, clear. She did not raise it. She did not need to. The cadets moved. At hour 36, a complication. The simulated chemical breach had weakened the structural supports in level 4. The simulation's AI was escalating the crisis, as it was designed to do. Partial collapse was imminent. 3 cadets were in the affected section. Marin Salt did not hesitate. She reassigned the Calori reinforcement team to structural bracing at the collapse points, buying time. She pulled the evacuation teams back to a safe perimeter, and she went down to level 4 herself. Rishal stood up from his chair in the operations center. He did not remember standing. He watched the feed as she moved through the shaking corridor, guiding the 3 trapped cadets Aneth and 2 Celerin, all smaller species, all disoriented by the structural vibration, toward the emergency shaft she had identified on the annex schematics she had memorized during the first week. The corridor buckled. A support beam shifted. On the feed, Rishal saw her push the Neth cadet through the shaft opening, then turn back for the Celerin. The second Celerin was frozen, locked in a stress response that her species defaulted to when structural stability was compromised, a biological shutdown, a survival mechanism that worked in natural caves and was catastrophic in a collapsing corridor. Marin Salt crouched beside the frozen Celerin. On the audio feed, her voice was barely audible above the structural groaning. "Hey, Fennec, I need you to look at me. Not at the ceiling, at me. Good, we're going to move now. I'm going to put my hand on your back and we're going to walk. You don't have to think about the ceiling. I'm thinking about the ceiling for both of us. Just walk." The Celerin walked. Marin Salt guided her through the shaft opening 3 seconds before the corridor section collapsed. Rishal sat down. His hands were steady. His crest was flat against his skull, a Vashari stress response he had not experienced since his last deployment 11 years ago. The capstone exercise concluded at hour 72. The evacuation was scored as a complete success. 0 simulated casualties, all cadets extracted. The scoring algorithm awarded Marin Salt the highest individual command score in the exercise's history. Rishal did not look at the score immediately. He sat in the operations center and watched the cadets file out of the exercise area, tired, filthy, carrying the weight of 3 days without real sleep. Marin Salt walked among them. The Celerin Fennec walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The Calori commander, Vorin, fell into step on her other side. Behind them, the rest of the cohort arranged itself into a formation that was not regulation and was not accidental. She was in the center. The formation moved around her. She had not asked for it. She had not ordered it. It had organized itself, the way a system organizes around the component that holds it together. Rishal watched, and the thing he had been trying to name for 8 weeks finally resolved. It was not her tactics. It was not her persistence. It was not her ability to read a room, exploit a terrain gap, or walk into a threat environment unarmed. Those were applications, the way a blade's edge was an application of metallurgy. It was the thing underneath. She made the cadets around her better, not by being the best, by being the one who saw what each of them could be if someone asked them the right question. The Calori who had never thought of their mass as a rescue tool until she framed it that way. The Celerin who had never navigated broken terrain until she told him he was the fastest thing in the element. The Torvin who had never considered that 4 arms meant 2 tasks at once until she did the math for him. She did not lead by being above them. She led by seeing them clearly, and in seeing them she made them see themselves. Rishal had trained 11 cohorts. He had produced officers who went on to command fleets, hold borders, and negotiate the cold peace that kept the Ascendancy's member species from turning on each other. He had never produced this. After the capstone, Rishal walked the annex grounds alone. The twin moons were up, casting their doubled light across the alkaline flats, and the air had the clean mineral smell that came after the rain stopped. He walked the eastern perimeter, past the overlook where he had found her sitting 6 weeks ago, past the conditioning hall where Davin had first reported the cargo webbing improvisation, past the drill yard where she had stood in the rain on her first day. He thought about Daventhar, the Kalori officer he had trained 9 years ago. Daventhar had been brilliant, sharp tactical instincts, overwhelming physical capability, a natural authority that other cadets responded to without question. He had gone on to command the 2nd Border Fleet with distinction, and Rishal had considered him the vindication of his teaching methodology. But Daventhar had led from the front. He had been the point of the spear, the strongest individual in any formation he commanded, and his subordinates had followed because he was simply, indisputably, the best among them. It was a valid form of leadership. It was the form the Ascendancy's doctrine was built to produce. Marin Salt led from the center. She led by making the spear itself sharper, by understanding each component and placing it where it cut deepest. She would never be the strongest individual in any formation. She would always be the one who made the formation stronger than the sum of its parts. It was a form of leadership the Ascendancy's doctrine had no name for, because it had never encountered a species whose evolutionary strategy was built around compensating for individual weakness through collective optimization. Humans were not strong. They were not fast. They were not armored or augmented or neurally linked. They were the species that looked at every other species' advantages and said, "I cannot match that, but I can use it. I can see what you are, and I can put you where you belong, and the thing we build together will be more than either of us alone." It was, Rishal realized, the most dangerous capability the Ascendancy had ever enrolled. Not because it was a weapon, because it was a multiplier. The final review was conducted in Rishal's office, as it always was. Marin Salt sat across from him in a chair still too large for her body, her hands resting on her thighs, her uniform bearing the stains and wear of the capstone exercise that the annex laundry had not yet erased. "Your physical scores remain in the bottom quartile," he said. "Your tactical reasoning scores are the highest in this cohort, and in the top 3% of all cadets the 9th has assessed in 23 years. Your command exercise performance is the highest ever recorded." "I understand. The recommendation board meets tomorrow. I will be submitting my assessment." "I understand that too." He looked at her, she looked back, the steady regard, the absence of performance, the thing underneath. "When you walked into the settlement unarmed during the command stress assessment," he said, "I watched you on the monitoring feed. Your expression did not change. I have been trying to understand that for 3 weeks. My expression didn't change because the calculation was already done. By the time I walked in, I had already decided what the situation needed and what I was willing to provide. There was nothing left to feel about it." "That is not a Vashari answer." "No, it's a human one." Rishal opened his desk drawer and removed a small metal object, a pin, Vashari military tradition, stamped with the sigil of the 9th Ascendancy's command track. It was the pin he had worn as a young officer, before he had become an instructor, before he had spent 23 years watching cadets arrive and break and sometimes, rarely, endure. He set it on the desk between them. "I have awarded this pin once in my career," he said, "to a Kalori officer named Daventhar 9 years ago. He went on to command the Ascendancy's 2nd Border Fleet. He was the finest cadet I ever trained." He paused. He was until this cohort. Marin Salt looked at the pin. Her expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes, a slight deepening, a current beneath the still surface. "I'm recommending you for advanced command track," Rishal said. "Full certification. The board will approve it. Your scores leave them no discretion." He paused, weighing what he was about to say. In 23 years, he had learned to measure his words the way a surgeon measured incisions, deep enough to reach the thing that mattered, not so deep that it cut something that could not heal. What he was about to say was not in any instructor's manual. It was not part of any review protocol. It was the thing that happened when a professional who had spent his career building a standard encountered someone who made him question whether the standard had been the right thing to build. That recommendation is professional. The pin is personal. It means I am telling you that in 23 years of this work, you are the closest thing I have found to the kind of officer I spent my career trying to produce. She reached out and picked up the pin, held it in her palm, looked at it, then at him. "Commandant, with respect, you didn't produce me, Earth did." Rishal felt something shift in his chest, not the sharp dislocation of surprise, but the slow, deep settling of a weight finding its resting place. She was right. He had not produced her. He had provided the environment, the pressure, the tests. But the thing that had survived them, the persistence, the calm, the decision architecture that bent but did not break, the ability to see what others could become and pull it out of them with a question and a steady hand that was not his. That was hers. That was theirs. "Yes," he said, "Earth did." He looked at the window behind her. The alkaline rain had started again, streaking the armorplas in amber threads. Somewhere below, a new intake cohort was assembling on the drill yard, facing the same rain, the same test. Marin Salt stood, closed her hand around the pin, and walked to the door. She paused there, framed in the oversized doorway, small against the architecture that had never been built for her. "Commandant. Cadet. The new intake. There's another human in the roster. Terran inclusion protocol." "I am aware." "She's 19, first-generation spacer, no military background. She's going to struggle with the physical modules. Most likely, she'll need someone to lower the door controls." Rishal looked at her. The rain was heavier now, and the light through the window caught the mineral streaks on the armorplas and threw faint amber shadows across her face. She was not smiling, but the corners of her mouth held something that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, the quiet, earned expression of someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side carrying not triumph but understanding. "I will see to it," Rishal said. Marin Salt nodded once. Then she walked out into the corridor, into the rain, into whatever came next, with the same unhurried stride she had used on the first day, the stride of a species that had been walking through hostile environments since before they had language, and had never once considered stopping. Rishal stood at his window and watched her cross the drill yard below. The rain fell around her, amber and alkaline, etching its temporary marks on her skin and her fatigues and the concrete she walked across. She did not hurry. She did not cover her head. She walked through it the way she walked through everything, steady, present, undiminished. He watched until she reached the far building and disappeared through the entrance. Then he turned back to his desk, opened the new intake roster, and found the second human's name. He read her file. He noted the gaps, the weaknesses, the points where the Annex's standard would press against her biology and her training and her resolve. He noted the places where she would need accommodation, and the places where accommodation would undermine the lesson. And he began, as he always did, with the question that 23 years had taught him was the only one worth asking. What are you when everything is taken away? He had asked it of Kelori, Torvin, Celerin, Neth, Vasheri. He had asked it of 11 cohorts and hundreds of cadets, And the answer had always been the same species of silence, the silence of a mind reaching for its augmentations, its armor, its biological advantages, and finding them stripped away, and in that stripping, finding less. Until the quiet, stubborn, persistent, small, unstoppable human who had stood in the alkaline rain, because the order was the order and the rain was just weather, who had walked into a threat environment unarmed because the math said it was correct, who had crouched beside a frozen cellar in a collapsing corridor and said, "I'm thinking about the ceiling for both of us," who had looked at every test the Annex could devise and responded not with excellence, but with something deeper and harder and more durable than excellence, the refusal to be less than what she was. Rishal closed the file, opened his assessment template, and for the first time in 23 years, he changed the introductory line. The old line read, "This cohort contained cadets of expected quality." The new line read, "This cohort contained a human." He looked at the sentence. It was enough. It said everything the board needed to know, and everything the next 23 years of his career would be shaped by, and everything the Ascendancy's training doctrine would eventually have to reckon with. One sentence, one species, one cadet who stood in the rain. And Rishal, who had spent his life teaching others what they were capable of, sat in his office and understood quietly, without drama, with the settled certainty of a professional who had finally encountered the thing he had been building toward without knowing it, that she had taught him.